Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to our episode on connecting despite differences. A reminder that this podcast is not to be construed as medical advice. We so appreciate your support in listening. Please help us expand our reach by sharing, leaving us stars, and especially written reviews. We would so appreciate it. Thank you so much. The intention of today's episode is to offer some mindful tools and strategies for approaching the experience of encountering those who might have different beliefs than us. Some tools and strategies to help you connect despite differences.
We hope that you will discover that when you explore differences in a mindful way, it can be the key to connecting and mutual understanding, and to a path forward that's much more easeful for all.
Some of the takeaways that we'll hope you'll get from listening to this episode is that mindfulness is a tool to approach how you show differences, regardless of the source of the differences. And that you recognize that differences are a part of the normal human experience. They are part of the spectrum in all of our lives and are advantageous from a broader perspective.
So our first offering today would be to pause and be present for the differences in the first place, that they exist at all, as well as the associated discomfort when we find ourselves with a difference of opinion or a difference of ideology, to notice and be aware of the difference, and to remember that mindfulness offers non-judgment. It's not necessarily a problem that there's a difference. There's nothing that necessarily needs to be fixed. The idea of tapping into your intention as a way through the discomfort can be a very valuable tool when you encounter someone who thinks or sees the world differently than you do. We often have big ideologic differences with others, whether it might be a teenager or a spouse or parents, or sometimes it's about vaccines. Sometimes it's about approaches to living in the world, to traveling, to whether masks are okay, all kinds of differences. We generally want the other person to understand our point of view, and yet we rarely show up understanding their point of view. And so mindfulness offers this opportunity to think about, when we want them to understand our point of view, how can we begin to understand and be flexible and open to their point of view? We don't have to agree with it. It's just a matter of choosing to show up in the way for the other person, even with a difference of opinion, that we would want them to show up for us. So when we want to connect with someone who happens to have a difference of opinion, we have to show up connecting, knowing that connection is really where we bridge those differences and can bridge understanding. And so often I offer the question of, what would love do, or what would something do? And so in this case, the question, what would connection do, is really powerful when you find yourself encountering a difference. And the difference, in my mind, perhaps a less emotionally charged difference than we often face, is even with a teenager. And so when my teenager has a very different opinion about whatever it might be, I often pause when I'm in that moment of frustration and judgment and not understanding, and honestly, perhaps not wanting to understand. And I ask myself, what would connection do? And connection would usually try to find some bridge of understanding. And then the other question I often find very helpful is asking, what would understanding do? Knowing that as a parent, we do very much want to understand, usually. And even when it comes to perhaps vaccine issues, and as a pediatrician, this comes up a lot. And when I ask myself, what would understanding do? It helps find a bridge and a place of connection that may not be there otherwise, and is a way to connect despite differences. The other approach that I bring up often in coaching, whether it's about parenting or relate other intimate relationships, or even with your parents, how are you alike? How are they just like you? And it usually is the case that we are alike in wanting the same outcome. We just have different ideas about how to get there. And we get stuck on the differences rather than the connecting despite differences. And so, for an example, with perhaps different opinions about vaccines, none of us want a loved one to die, and none of us want something bad to happen to anyone. And so tapping into that can be a really helpful way to try to connect across differences. I also find it an invitation to sort of notice our manual, because our manual says that if they want the same thing as us, they should also agree about the approach to it, and they often don't. And the manual offers that if we want them perhaps to respect our opinion, that we would respect theirs. If we want them to be patient, that we should be patient with them. And so I find that that can be a really helpful, very specific strategy in moving forward. What we would hope the other person would offer us, we could offer to them. And then the last bit of approach to connecting despite differences is, once again, focusing on what's in your control. We often want to fix the difference, change the difference. We show up thinking that we're right. And we may very well be, but it usually doesn't help us connect across differences. And it doesn't help us get to that bridge of understanding. And so if we can focus on what's in our control, which is purely how we show up for it, and choose to do that with intention, we can often connect much, much better despite underlying differences.
So speaking about the dynamic between a pair, perhaps you, dear listener, and a family member or a patient or someone else that you might notice that there's a difference in opinion or ideology. We've definitely all encountered situations like that. And their beliefs end up dictating their actions, and you end up disagreeing with their beliefs and their actions. And sometimes, because of our relationship with them, there is an inherent power dynamic that sometimes is built in voluntarily or unconsciously. And we might actually assume that we know better. And in some cases, we might actually know better. But I'd like to offer some alternative possibilities for contemplation. So, reminding you that you have your own areas of expertise, and however we like or dislike this, the other person who disagrees with you also has their own areas of expertise. And one commonality that is shared, regardless of who you are, is that most people are indeed the experts of their own lives, including us as healthcare professionals or as caregivers. And so, are we able to honor that aspect of the other person, even if they don't agree with us? Again, reminding us all that we cannot control the thoughts or actions of others. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't try to compassionately and openly have a dialogue with the other person with the intention of mutual understanding. And the key to this type of encounter is one of the key foundational attitudes of mindfulness, and that's curiosity. So I'd like to offer a reflection exercise at this time. When you are engaged in a difficult communication due to seemingly irreconcilable differences with another, what tends to happen? Is there some sort of habitual reaction with regards to the emotions that arise, like anger or fear or sadness? What body sensations do you notice? And what are some of the corresponding actions after such an exchange like this? And so, like Jesse previously said, what if you paused and took those extra few moments to notice and name the emotions and body sensations that were arising? And we know that naming helps to tame difficult emotions because it does help to disarm the activation of the amygdala that's firing that would otherwise send us into a stress reactivity response. That our brains view the disagreement as a potential perceived threat, which may or may not actually be true. And if you think about it in actuality during disagreements, really your life is most likely not in imminent danger. So, can we consciously recognize this as sometimes a disproportionate reaction to the argument or the differences that are arising in a discussion as really what it is? And then in response, choose a more appropriately proportionate response to that disagreement. And so mindfulness then allows us to recognize the sensations of our body and emotions during stress. And while you recognize that, you're pausing, you're disarming, and then you can choose. You can continue to act in the same way with a stress reactivity trigger, or you can tap into a different pattern where you can choose to foster maybe a healthier habit of curiosity for the sake of finding out more. Maybe finding out more about the background of why the other person believes this, that, or the other, or acted in this particular way. And taking from a lot of formal mindfulness curricula, mindful communication could help us all in this type of exchange. Listening becomes a focal point for this type of discussion, where you intentionally suspend judgment and let your own curiosity be a driving sentiment. You can ask questions as the other person has finished sharing their perspective, not giving advice. And then you might ask for permission to present your perspective. And in a recent episode, we just talked about giving ourselves permission. But in difficult communications, it's oftentimes helpful to ask permission of the other person for you to share your own perspectives as well. Because frankly, if they're closed off and they don't want to hear your perspective, then it's a bit futile to continue. And it might actually create even more stress that's unneeded. But asking permission allows for an intentional pause. It shows respect and it shows that after you've already listened and remained open and exemplified curiosity about the other person's perspective, that herein also lies an opportunity for reciprocal opening and curiosity. All at the same time acknowledging that this type of exchange might be mutually difficult, but yet very fulfilling. So, some mindful questions that you might ask of the other person could be leading them through a mindful moment. Like, what are they feeling? Asking them to name their emotions. What body sensations are they noticing as they're having this exchange? And so these questions then provide an opportunity for the other person to experience a mindful pause for themselves that inherently might open up a broader perspective for them to notice. And I wanted to also add in here that we talk about the zones of safety, the zones of learning, where there are three concentric circles. The middle zone is the safety zone. The next ring out is a zone of challenge. So that's where we can explore our edge. This is where the capacity for growth occurs most often. And then beyond that is our zone of overwhelm, where our stress reactivity is triggered because there is indeed a perceived threat and our physiology is telling us that. And so I do want to say that when you are in a situation where there can be an offering of exploring of differences, I hope that you'll rest in trusting yourself, knowing when this type of discussion might be in your zone of challenge versus your zone of overwhelm. Because we don't want to encourage you to engage in this type of discussion if harm might result from this type of discussion. That in that situation, you can give yourself permission to allow and accept the differences just as you are, and that you can give yourself permission to uncouple and detach from the outcomes of the other's chosen beliefs or actions.
I had a couple thoughts here, which is this is the accept but don't like. Sometimes that's the path to take in a certain moment. Or sometimes we say what we think and we have to detach from the outcome. But for most of us, what's in alignment is to speak up, but then to detach. We don't have to change them or fix the other person. The other thing you brought up was this idea of noticing our own disproportionate reaction. And what came to mind is also realizing that the other person may be having a disproportionate reaction, and to give them the same courtesy that we would want for that. And it may or may not be our place to point that out to them or to fix that, but to, just as we pause and reflect on where we may be in this disproportionate reaction or zone of overwhelm, the other person may be also, and they may or may not have the mindfulness tools to know what to do with that and how to move forward. And so compassion all around in those moments, realizing that either person may be in the zone of overwhelm or having a disproportionate reaction, and that is part of being human. I often see people who have worked on this mindfulness and have done coaching, and then they get into a scenario where they don't handle it particularly well. And they think, well, I've done all this work and all this mindfulness, and I still got really upset. And then they're mad at themselves for that. And remembering that we are all human and that all we can do is move forward and show up for the next time, learning and seeing what worked. And I'm back to what we practice grows. And so we just keep practicing. And all of this is a practice. There's no perfect. And then the other thing that I thought worth mentioning again was your comment that we are experts at our own lives. And this came up in our recent episode around permission, and that we are experts in our own lives around permission. And so I think it's easier to see, but here it's also, we are experts in our own lives and other people are experts in their own lives. And what I see is challenging for many of us with all of our levels of training and education, we consider ourselves the experts. And if other people don't listen, we take it as an affront. And yet it may or may not have anything to do with us. And so recognizing that they are experts in their own lives, it doesn't mean that it doesn't disprove our own training or our own level of authority. It just is their decision, their informed consent, except that we often, it's clear for us that in a surgical case that's clear, but we may also want to sort of apply that to other things, that we don't always have to fix it. And sometimes the pause as you mentioned, and just sort of giving everyone that space. They may come back and with a shifted perspective or be curious. And in this idea of showing up with curiosity ourselves, when we do that, it opens the door for the other person to show up curious about our perspective. And that's where the crack lets the light in and we can move forward.
I think being very conscious and intentional about this pause in the midst of a heated discussion about differences can activate our mirror neurons. And so if we are intentional in noticing our own stress reactivity and we're intentional about tapping into curiosity instead of going off into a very anger driven emotional rant, for instance, as one potential stress reactivity response, um, then the other person might pick up on that too, in terms of, oh, they're actually reacting in a way that is not what I anticipated. And that also somewhat is powerful in disarming their stress reactivity cycle too. Because we, as humans, we have mirror neurons that we talk about more in empathy, but we oftentimes can notice and even sometimes literally mirror the mood of the other person that we're in a dialogue with without even realizing it. So, capturing upon our own agency to be able to pause and be present with curiosity might result in some unexpected openings.
I'm reminded of the phrase that you share a lot, which is be the change that you want to see. And so showing up for differences as the person that you want, as what you want to see in the other person, and being that change and being that voice of connection and showing up with the energy of connecting despite the differences will lead to the connection.
As always, we'd like to close our podcasts with some reflection questions. So, do you think you could incorporate some aspects of mindful communication that we had mentioned into situations where differences are abound? After hearing from another and you've shared your perspective, if there still remains an impasse, can you remind yourself still that the other person, just like you, wants to feel safe and be happy and healthy, perhaps agreeing to disagree? Can you detach yourself from wanting their approach to be anything different in trying to achieve those same goals of feeling safe and happy and healthy and letting them figure it out for themselves? And what if you accepted that they too are trying to do the best that they can?
Thanks so much for listening and joining us today. If you are part of the healthcare community and have not yet joined us in the Mindful Healthcare Collective, please do. We continue to offer free weekly online wellness offerings for healers and would love to have any and all of you join us. You can find us at the mindfulhealthcarecollective.com, as well as in our Facebook group by the same name. And please join us after the sound of the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering. As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
Welcome to this mindful moment. If it's safe for you to do so, I invite you to close your eyes in this reflection practice. This is inspired by the difficult communications calendar from the mindfulness-based stress reduction curriculum. So bringing to mind recounting a recent difficult communication, maybe not the most difficult communication you've ever had, but one that's mild to moderately difficult, one that is either resolved or hasn't been resolved. At the time of the encounter, while it was happening, were you aware that there were differences and that difficulty was arising? How did your body feel during this difficult situation, this difficult communication that was occurring? What emotions and thoughts did you have during the event? What was the outcome? And now, as you're recounting it, what's showing up for you? Like body sensations or emotions? If the situation has not resolved, how do you think you might incorporate some mindful communication into this encounter or potentially future similar types of difficult communications? Do you think you could perhaps listen more, ask more open ended questions, offer a mindful pause to them through curiosity about their own emotions and body sensations arising? Reminding yourself now during this exercise that just like me, this other person wants to be happy, healthy, and feel safe. I hope that this reflection helps to foster new approaches when experiencing difficult communications. Thanks so much for joining us for this mindful moment.